tutti a casa loro col primo aereo che deve partire. Non possiamo riempirci di Africa in Italia. L'Africa in Italia non ci sta. L'Africa in Italia non ci sta.
Hi guys, welcome to the channel. This is my take. In this video, we're going to show empirical evidence that suggests that ethnic majority populations in the West may be open to liberal nationalism and the assimilationist approach, and reduce their support for populist right parties as a result of it. In fact, I have a very compelling piece of evidence that I'll discuss about 9 minutes into the video that will blow your mind. So stay tuned. For those of you who don't know, this video is part 3 of a 4-part video series on liberal nationalism and how to defeat the populist right. If you haven't seen the last video where we discussed what liberal nationalism is and why we need it, click on the link in the description. If you're new, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for further content. Anyway, let's get down to it. For liberal nationalism to have any appeal among the population, it would have to be shown that what falls under national culture is actually important to the national identity of populations in the West. Now, if you remember from the last video, liberal nationalism includes both civic and cultural elements of national identity. So I looked at a study by Professor Stephen Schulman, who asked members of the ethnic majority in different countries what attributes they found important for someone to really be considered part of the nation. They were then asked to rate the importance of these attributes on a 4-point scale, with 1 being very important and 4 being not very important at all. Now, if we look at some of the civic attributes, we see that things like citizenship, simply being a citizen on paper, was ranked quite important at 1.65 on a 4-point scale in the West, Western countries being Western Europe, Canada, and the United States. Someone feeling that they're part of the nation was also ranked highly at 1.58. Respect for political institutions and the law of the country was also ranked important to really be considered part of the nation, with an average score of 1.58 in the West. And finally, being born in the country, so birthright citizenship regardless of ethnic background, was ranked moderately important at 2.2. Now, if we look at an exclusivist attribute such as religion, it was only ranked at 3.1. So most people did not find being part of the dominant religion important to really be considered part of the nation. And if we look at achievable cultural markers such as language, that was ranked as very important at 1.49. And when people were asked whether minorities sharing in the nation's customs and traditions was important to being part of the nation, people gave that a ranking of 2.62 on a scale where 1 was agree strongly and 5 was disagree strongly. So people only moderately agreed with that. So to recap, ethnic majorities in Western countries find civic attributes like being a citizen, feeling that you're part of the nation, having respect for the country's political institutions and law, and to a lesser extent being born in the country, important to really be considered part of the nation. Cultural attributes like language, and to a lesser extent customs and traditions, are also important. Exclusivist attributes like being part of the dominant religion are not important. And so this suggests that ethnic majorities in the West are generally on board with the markers of national identity laid out by liberal nationalism. Now, other studies come to similar conclusions. Matthew Goodwin asked people in 6 Western European countries what they thought the first and the second most important preconditions were before an immigrant should be allowed to gain citizenship. And respecting the country's institutions and laws came out on top at 60%. But cultural aspects like speaking the language and sharing national cultural values came close second at 55% and 40% respectively. Now, a recent survey in the Netherlands found that the majority, 67% of Dutch people, feel that the Dutch identity is under threat. Now, among populist voters, This was 96% and 95% for the PVV and FVD respectively. However, this feeling of identity under threat was not just limited to populist voters. Majorities in parties across the political spectrum felt the same, including 80% of the right-wing liberal VVD supporters, 79% of Christian Democratic CDA supporters, 71% of socialist SP supporters, and even a significant majority, 42%, of Social Democratic PVDA or Labour Party supporters felt the same, just to name a few. In fact, only 3 parties listed had an outright majority who did not feel this way. This suggests that populist parties have not yet reached the ceiling of support for issues concerning national identity because people across the political spectrum are concerned by this. It also suggests that many mainstream parties, both on the right and some on the left, may be able to capitalize on these issues within their own support base. And so liberal nationalism could be a strategy that can be used by mainstream parties. Now, as I discussed in part 2, liberal nationalism espouses a more assimilationist model of integration into the national culture. And this is different from political multiculturalism, which seeks to promote and maintain the development of separate cultures within society, often doing so by giving subsidies to different cultural groups to maintain their own cultural institutions. But this model of dealing with immigration and diversity doesn't have a lot of support in the West. Schulman finds that 70% of respondents in the West preferred assimilation to multiculturalism. In addition, respondents in the West disagreed moderately with political multiculturalism, that is, the government giving subsidies to minorities to maintain separate culture and traditions. And this got an average score of 3.47 on a 5-point agree-disagree scale. Now, this indicates significant majority support for the more assimilationist approach advocated by liberal nationalism and low support for political multiculturalism that characterized a lot of Western countries, especially in the 1990s. So the case against maintaining ethnic differences through political multiculturalism doesn't just stop at citizens' attitudes, however. A study by Matthew Wright found that holding all other things equal, in the most politically multicultural countries, people actually became more ascriptive in their conceptions of national identity over time. That is to say, in countries which implemented multiculturalism, people emphasized less achievable characteristics of national identity, such as ethnicity or religion, rather than elective characteristics, such as feeling part of the nation. Now, this contradicts what some people might have expected of political multiculturalism, that it would promote more elective and inclusive conceptions of the nation. But this is not the case. But if you think about it, this isn't actually surprising. Political multiculturalism de-emphasizes the need for immigrant minorities to assimilate into the national culture. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising that as minorities increase in number, members of the ethnic majority should feel culturally threatened, because minorities are not expected to significantly adapt to national values that mirror the majority's own cultural norms, but are rather encouraged to emphasize maintaining their own culture. So, hypothetically, the inverse might then also be true, that as minorities assimilate into the national culture, ethnic majorities feel less culturally threatened. Now, this hypothetical scenario may in fact have empirical evidence too. Now, this is the compelling piece of evidence I was talking about in the intro. A study by Eric Kaufman that focused on white Britons had respondents that were grouped into one of 3 groups. One group was exposed to a diversity story that emphasized the fact that Britain is going through rapid demographic changes, that said that white Britons were already a minority in certain cities and would be a minority in Britain within a few decades. And the story asked respondents to embrace this diversity, highlighting its importance for the economy. The second group read an assimilation story that emphasized Britain's long history with emigration, but pointed out that these past waves of immigrants successfully assimilated into Britain, pointing to typically British celebrities like Boris Johnson, who had immigrant ancestors. And the story emphasized that even in the face of immigration, British culture would not change radically, just like in the past. And the third group was a control group. Now, the result was that those exposed to the assimilation story were significantly less likely to support a hard Brexit and significantly more likely to favor a more liberal immigration policy. Indeed, specifically among Brexit voters, 40.9% in the control group were willing to pay 5% of their income to stop all EU immigration, compared to just 26.5% of Brexit voters who listened to the assimilation story. Now, this is one of the first studies to show that conservative ethnic majority opinion can be shifted away from populist right parties and policies, and if emphasis is placed on assimilation and continuity and stability that is valued by conservative voters, it suggests that the potential success of an assimilationist approach in reducing support for right-wing populism. And also, it suggests the success of assimilationist counter-narratives. Now, this is compelling because it's the first piece of evidence that actually shows an aspect of liberal nationalism that might be able to reduce support for the populist right. Now, in the last video, I argued that the theoretical reasons why there need not necessarily be a tension between liberalism and nationalism, why liberal nationalism is not an oxymoron. But there might also be empirical reasons to believe this. David Miller and Sundas Ali did a study investigating the connection between national identity and social justice, and they found, on the one hand, that uncritical patriots tended to identify more strongly with their nation, but they also found that being a critical patriot also increased one's national attachment score, that you had more national pride, which shows that there's not necessarily a contradiction between identifying strongly with your nation, but being critical of its policies. In other words, it's possible to be both liberal and national. It's possible, at least for some people, to endorse a collective national identity while making room for pluralism within that framework. The study also finds, however, that those with the highest level of national attachment were also more likely to define their national identity in cultural rather than civic terms. Now, this is not necessarily a problem for liberal nationalism, because liberal nationalism does include cultural elements in addition to civic ones. Now, the only problem occurs where these cultural elements are not accessible to minorities. So in principle, things like a nation's language or its literature can be learned and endorsed by anyone. Pride in the country's history may be a bit more problematic if countries have troubled histories, but even that can be molded. As I discussed in the previous video, national histories can be told in inclusive ways. For instance, a black American who's proud of his country's history probably isn't talking about slavery. Now, it's true that in general, minorities do tend to have lower levels of national pride than ethnic majorities, so finding an inclusive liberal nationalist identity is still a work in progress. But the difference isn't that big. Like in the Netherlands, a significant majority, 65% of minorities, feel either very or reasonably proud of the Netherlands compared to 72% of the general population, which shows that the potential for minorities to also take part in a liberal nationalist identity as well. So, in conclusion, although we can't necessarily draw a direct link between citizens endorsing liberal nationalist aspects of national culture and a liberal nationalist approach leading to declining populist support, it's still telling. Telling in the sense that European citizens appear to be attached especially to cultural aspects of national identity in addition to civic ones. Now, given the insecurity felt by many citizens regarding their national identity, and the clear link between cultural insecurity and support for right-wing populism, it may be the case that insofar as liberal nationalism succeeds in reaffirming citizens' feelings toward civic and cultural aspects of their national identity and emphasizing the assimilation of newcomers, it has the potential to diminish the feelings of cultural insecurity felt by millions across the West that is driving right-wing populism. Therefore, the politicians, the media, and society should begin moving towards a liberal nationalist discourse, liberal nationalist policies, and assimilation. But what would that look like? What is liberal nationalism in practice? Watch part 4 to find out. So stay tuned, watch, like, and subscribe, because this was my take.